Welcome to the Institute for East Asian Studies special lecture series. My name is Wenxin Ye. I am professor of history at UC Berkeley and director of the Institute. We have this afternoon as our distinguished speaker, Professor Wang Gungwu from Singapore. Now, Professor Wang is a name that requires very little introduction, but nonetheless, as it's particularly impressive, if we try to come to grip with the overall profile of his academic career, I thought that I'd do the dutiful, touching on the various aspects of his contributions. So Professor Wang was educated in Singapore. He received his bachelor's and master's degrees in history from University of Malaya in Singapore. And then he received his PhD also in history from the University of London, from the School of Oriental and African Studies. His research interests include Chinese history, the Chinese overseas nationalism and migrations. Intellectually as well as institutionally, he has been a founding figure of the field of China studies in the English-speaking world, and also a founding figure of several major centers of China studies in Australia and Southeast Asia. He has a long list of publications, which I will not try to share with you. I think it's enough for us just to refresh our memories here that his books since 2008 include, in English, the following: Renewal, the Chinese State, and the New Global History, which is featured right here, brand new, Chinese University of Press from Hong Kong. And then another China cycle, Committing to Reform, also a 2013 book. Wang Gungwu, Educator and Scholar, which is edited by Professor Zheng Yongnian in collaboration with Pua Kok Ku, also coming out in 2013. Wang Gungwu, Junzi, Scholar Gentleman, in conversation with Asad Iqbal Latif, which came out in 2010. And Voice of Malayan Revolution, the CPM radio war against Singapore and Malaysia, 1960 to 1981, edited in collaboration with Ong Wei Chong, that came out in 2009, and China and the New International Order, edited together with Professor Zheng Yongnian in 2008. Now, in addition, there are original publications that came out and in Chinese. These include a title, 华人与中国王庚武自选集, and then also in collaboration with Professor Zheng Yongnian, 中国的主义之争从五四运动到当代. And virtually anytime you run into a scholar in East Asia, especially in Taiwan, Hong Kong, or China, the conversation would touch upon this most recent book by Professor Wang, namely 离乡别土，境外看中华. So beyond that, Professor Wang is a commander of the British Empire. He's a fellow and former president of the Australian Academy of the Humanities, foreign honorary member of the American Academy of Arts and Sciences, member of the Academia Sinica in Taipei, honorary member of the Chinese Academy of Social Sciences in Beijing, and he was conferred the International Academic Prize, Fukuoka Asian Cultural Prizes. In Singapore, he is chairman of the Institute of Southeast Asian Studies, chairman of the Lee Kuan Yew School of Public Policy at National University of Singapore. Now, his teaching career, that is after his degree at SOAS, his teaching career took him first to the University of Malaya. That was in the 1950s all the way through 1968. He was professor of history there. And then the Australian National University from 1968 to 1986, where he was professor and head of the Department of Far Eastern History and director of the Research of Pacific Studies. From 1986 to 1985, he was vice chancellor of the University of Hong Kong. And from 1997 to 2007, he was director of East Asian Institute of the NUS. And upon his retirement, the NUS dedicated an entire section of its library for the creation of a Gungwu special collection. So we are certainly very pleased and very honored to have Professor Wang Gungwu flying in from Singapore to meet with us and to present this lecture. Please join me in welcoming Professor Wang.
Thank you, Wenxin. Thank you, Professor Ye. That was really too much. I didn't expect to have such a lot of time spent on me. It gives me great pleasure to be here in Berkeley. It's I don't know how many times I've been here, but each time I come, I feel it's like a new place because it keeps on changing. So many interesting things happening. And I'm delighted to be back here again. I've been working on problems concerning China and the Chinese overseas for a long time. And I've been thinking about the following themes when I was asked to choose a subject for today. And what I really wanted to think through anyway, three aspects of the subject. One is something that I've been interested for a long time, and that is the question of the family among Chinese overseas. We all know there's a great literature on the family in China, much less so about family and families outside of China, and how that was carried forward, developed in different parts of Southeast Asia. The second thing that interested me was to look at different periods, which are still about the Chinese abroad, but not unrelated, as always, with China. And that is a question of China or the Chinese as the enemy. That's another subject that has interested me. And thirdly, I've been very much involved now, much less as a historian. I've been sort of a traitor to my field. I've been observing contemporary China for a fair bit now, and my responsibilities in Singapore has made me much more conscious of contemporary China than I used to be. So I've been following the question of being global. A very difficult word to pin down, but never quite been applied, to my mind anyway, to how the Chinese outside of China is responding to a China that is going global. So I'd like to pick some points up about that one. In each case, I thought to tie them together, because they're very different subjects, different topics. To tie them together, I picked on one idea which came to me more recently, and that is, what is exceptional about any of these? What is exceptional about the family outside China, among the Chinese? What is exceptional about the Chinese being the enemy? And what is so exceptional about Chinese responding to a larger world, a global world? So I use that word as a starting point to what I want to say. And when I thought about it, I was reminded very much of when that word first came to my mind. It was a long time ago, but that was when I first read Francis Xu's Chinese and Americans. He made me think about the Chinese being very different from the Americans. That was the first book I've ever read which actually directly compared Chinese people with Americans. I'm sure there were other books, but I wasn't familiar at that time. But Francis Hsu's book drew my attention to it, and I remember at the time, anyway, it's a long time ago, published in 1953, what caught my eye was how he made them sound. The Americans and Chinese sound very exceptional and very different. And of course, those are the days when there were quite a lot of books about what people call national character, national identity. Lots of those books were around in the 1940s and 50s, mainly in Europe, but the Americans also had done some of it. Now, Francis Hsu had never written on this kind of subject before. I mean, he was an anthropologist, and his first work, which I read as a student, which I enjoyed enormously, was called Under the Ancestors' Shadow, which of course comes back to the family, which is in fact all about the family. And so that again linked me back to, because I was interested in the family outside, to Francis. And Francis Hsu's work, of course, talked about the family and the individual, and this is one of his starting points for contrasting Chinese and Americans, that there are different attitudes towards the family, different family structures, and how the individual who was related to the family was extremely different. So he, at least so he described them, and he focused very much on this aspect, coming at it from, I don't know exactly what he was coming at from, because he was, as those of you who know his work would know, he was a social anthropologist trained in the British tradition, and he had come to the United States, I think, in the mid-1940s, after his time back in China, and then he came to the States, where, of course, the tradition is much more what I think was called then cultural anthropology. And I remember sort of vaguely about the distinction being made by the British anthropologists and the American anthropologists between social and cultural anthropology. But there was Francis Hsu, trained by the British in the tradition of very much about kinships. It's all the kinship approach, which is all about African tribes and Oceanic tribes and Polynesian tribes and Melanesian tribes and so on, but mostly about starting with kinship, which is very different from the tradition in the United States, I believe. Anyway, so he had that background, so I guess he was using that, in a way, his kinship interest, to start him on the family, because that's what he wrote about in his Under the Ancestors' Shadow earlier on. In any case, I don't want to go too much into it, but simply to say how it came to me was because he wrote about people, and what I was interested on reflecting on his interest was the fact that he himself came from Dongbei. I think he was born in the Liaoning, and he grew up there, educated there, finished high school. Then he moved out, studied a bit in Shanghai. Then he went to England. And when he did his field work for his PhD research on Yunnan, Under the Ancestors' Shadow, he was really describing the various peoples in Yunnan, and he was describing their family structures and so on. But what struck me at the time was that both in his home area, as well as his work in Yunnan, he was talking about migrant peoples, because neither of those places were the homeland of the Han people. And all his descriptions about Han, incidentally, he didn't really talk much about the minority peoples in Yunnan. He was talking about the Han family structure in Yunnan. So he was talking about the Han family structure of people who had migrated out of the heartland of the Han peoples, because to Dongbei, they only started moving there in large numbers. His own family, in particular, had walked there, he told me, all the way from Shandong in the late 19th century, when Manchuria was opened up for Chinese migration. So he's one of the products of a migrant family to Dongbei. Then he spent his time during the war, doing his work in Yunnan, on the Han, but of course the Han are also migrants into Yunnan much earlier, but they were still migrants from, say, from the Ming Dynasty onwards, after the Yuan conquest of Dali, from then onward, and then continually migrating, lots and lots of Han people migrating into Yunnan over the centuries, but gradually over the centuries. And in particular, of course, and I think he mentions it, I forget whether it was him or it was someone else who was his colleague, incidentally very interesting too, was Tian Rukang, who's actually from Kunming. And Tian Rukang used to tell me his family had migrated from Nanjing, was part of the Ming garrisons that were sent from Nanjing when Zhu Yuanzhang was the emperor. He sent his garrisons, Nanjing troops, to garrison Kunming, and he's descended from those garrisons. So I remember Yunnan, at least in the Han people, were very much migrants, and he still thought of himself as someone from Nanjing family who migrated among these non-Han people in Yunnan after 500 or 600 years. So I was very struck by that. So with that sort of background, I was curious that Francis came to the United States the first few years. He talked about the Chinese, he talked about the Americans. He never really told us that the Chinese he talked about, including his own experiences of the family and that of Yunnan, were also migrants. But then when he came to the United States, he didn't talk about the Chinese in America, which I found a bit interesting. Somehow that sort of wasn't in his sight. But anyways, that stimulated me, because being a migrant myself, incidentally I was born in Indonesia and not, so I'm really way out, and really wondered about all the description about the Chinese without reference to the Chinese in America was curious to me at the time. Just to leave it at that, I leave it at that, but simply to go on to say that what it did to me was to arouse me to think about the Chinese family in Southeast Asia. But I didn't do any research at the time, but it's just curious. And then I was struck by a few things which I later on followed up. At the time I didn't think of it, but later on I followed up to note that the Chinese as migrants to Southeast Asia, and they date back much longer, of course, than even the Chinese in Yunnan. We can, I suppose, date back for nearly 1,000 years of the Chinese traders coming to Southeast Asia in larger and larger numbers. But of course, they were not migrants in our sense of the word. They were traders, but they were those who settled. And those who settled, from the bit fragmentary information we have, would be those who married local women, and then their children grew up there. But what kind of family did they have? I mean, we have some examples of it, but let me not go into that. The norm, let me put it this way, the norm, as far as I can tell, right through that period in most of the territories where Chinese married local women and settled, was that they became assimilated. It was only a matter of time. After a couple of generations, probably, they were all assimilated. We don't have any records to prove that, except that later on we hear from time to time stories about people whose ancestors were Chinese. But what we do know later on, as a second phase, as it were, of the development, was after the Europeans arrived. And after the Europeans arrived with the Portuguese and Spanish, and then the Dutch and the English, then things began to change a little. They changed a little, at least because we have the records of it. The Europeans recorded more about the Chinese than any of the indigenous sources ever did. In fact, in the indigenous sources, it's pretty rare to find any reference to Chinese at all. But in the European sources, you're much more aware of the Chinese merchants, traders, and some Chinese families. And then we note that for the countries like the lands settled or ruled by the Portuguese and the Spanish, the Catholic countries, particularly Spanish Philippines, then it was very clear cut. For the Chinese to settle down, they invariably had to be Catholics, had to be done by the church if they'd be properly registered, and then they are able to own land, they have families and so on. And then that was an interesting example, but most of the time you would say, one can say that they assimilated to become Chinese mestizos in the Philippines. But of course there was a strategy there. I won't go into the details, but the strategy there was that those Chinese would keep two families, one back in Fujian and the other in the Philippines. So almost invariably, and the Chinese records show that they would have one family in China, one family in the Philippines. The ones in the Philippines, however, would become Chinese mestizos. But how they managed their relationship with their half-brothers, half-sisters, and their descendants later on I don't have any clear records, but I believe some people are working on it right now. So that's one area. But much more interesting, and of course, and this didn't apply to places like Vietnam, Thailand, Cambodia, and so on, because the Europeans weren't there, so we don't know much about them. But we do know that there were Chinese there, and they pretty nearly assimilated without any difficulties in those areas. The people whom we know a little bit more about are in Thailand, where at least there's some Thai records referring to them, and that's because they assimilated only too well. The successful ones, anyway, the successful ones marry into the aristocracy, and they would have families which are socially respectable, and they became quite proud of their Thai background, even though they may from time to time refer to themselves as having had a Chinese ancestor. But that's, that's the norm, I would say. In general, people just became, wherever they are, they became accepted, integrated, if not totally assimilated locally. With the exception of two areas, the areas controlled by the Dutch and the areas later on controlled by the English, that's the Malay side. But basically the Dutch pattern is what is so interesting about it. That was an exception. Now I can use the word exception here now quite cheerfully. It was an exception because there the Dutch found the Chinese useful. They weren't interested in their being Christian or being Western in any way. They weren't interested at all. On the contrary, they were interested in keeping them Chinese, because as Chinese, they could help the Dutch trade with China. They could help the Dutch relate to all the Chinese around the archipelago and help to link up the trading networks that the Chinese had already established with the Dutch capital in Batavia. And that way they found keeping these people Chinese and encouraging them to remain Chinese was in their interest, in the interest of the East India Company. But of course, it was always in the interest of the Chinese. Just that elsewhere in the past, they couldn't do it. But here was an actual administrative group, set of officials, who encouraged them to stay Chinese. And that set the pattern for the local born, what the Indonesians call Peranakan, the local born, or some Malay words also use the word Baba, who were established. They were almost invariably well-established families, successful Chinese families, married locally, and local could be a wide range of people, with one proviso, as far as we know, no Muslims. Marrying a Muslim would create different kind of problems, but if they married non-Muslims, and there were enough non-Muslims around, then they would establish a Chinese family, even though the mother was not Chinese. And then after one or two generations, every effort was made to keep them Chinese, either by marrying the daughters to Chinese coming out from China, so you establish a different network. As new Chinese come, you marry your daughters off to them, and wherever possible, to make sure that your sons marry other half-Chinese, and if at all possible, find a bride from China. But the pattern of remaining Chinese, depending on this family unit, where it starts off with a non-Han, a non-Chinese mother, but eventually becoming more and more Chinese over the centuries. It's quite remarkable. By the time we actually see them around in Singapore, the records are very clear, where they become very powerful families in Singapore, Malacca, and Penang, these Peranakan families. They are probably more Chinese in blood than most other Chinese, because they have successfully and deliberately made sure that their children married Chinese wherever possible, as much as possible anyway throughout the time. As I said, I don't want to overgeneralize, but to say that was the basic pattern. So that's where the family becomes very special. But then something else happened. Now I'm talking about the first few phases of Chinese change, but something happens, and that's after the opening of China. Because up to this time, of course, these people were very important for the Dutch and the English who followed for their trading with China. But once China was opened up, then their function became less significant, less important. And on the other hand, more and more Chinese came out of China. Once China was opened up, all the ports are open in Hong Kong and along the whole coast all the way to Shanghai. And more Chinese came out of Southeast Asia. Large numbers came. And these large numbers, of course, came at a different time now. The time of the beginning of sense of nation, sense of nationhood, nationalism, the kind of success that people like Sun Yat-sen, Kang Youwei, Liang Chichao, and who went amongst them enjoyed was because these were people who were fresh from China. Most of the people were fresh from China. The Paranakans, the Babas, were then under tremendous pressure to be more Chinese, because they were Chinese only in terms of their family structure and in the ways they organized their lives and their architecture of the homes, the possessions, and the various customs, some religious customs, that the ancestral worship and that sort of thing. But of course, what they didn't have, and the mothers, certainly the first generation of mothers couldn't provide, was the Chinese language. And essentially they lost the Chinese language. They spoke Malay, almost all of them spoke Malay, sometimes Thai, sometimes other dialects as well, Javanese or Minangkabau and Bugis, whatever, depending on where they were. But essentially, they didn't speak Chinese. Some of the males would learn some Chinese to keep up their business needs, but in the family was Malay speaking. And of course, with the 19th century influx of large numbers of Chinese from China, the pressure on these Chinese to learn Chinese, to become more Chinese, so to speak, and this is why I worked out this phrase of being more or less Chinese, comes in, because that was very clearly one of the things that really troubled them. And the Chinese who came out of China more recently looked at them and said, "You don't speak Chinese?" And so there was tremendous pressure on them. And this lasted for about 100 years, from the second half of the 19th century onward. But in the first period, no significant impression on them, because they were still the dominant group. The richest people in the Dutch East Indies, as well as the British Malaya, they were the richest, they had the properties and so on. So they felt the pressure, but they could afford to ignore it up to a point, although some individuals made their adjustments. But after the fall of the Qing dynasty, the whole thing changes. Nationalism becomes very strong. The events in China, the Japanese War, and various other things that intensified nationalism in China then were brought to Southeast Asia, and the pressure on all Chinese to identify with China in one way or the other, and even more than that, to identify with Chinese politics in one way or the other, became very strong indeed. And then these families were under tremendous pressure. So you had the pressure on the Peranakan family to somehow change, to adapt to the situation. I won't go into that, just to draw this fact about the family and how the exceptional group that these Peranakans were, and I think there's no question they were an exceptional group in the Malay archipelago, were forced to look afresh. And I won't go into the details now, but of course after the end of the European period, with decolonization, with new nationalism and so on, then everything changed for all Chinese. Whether you're Peranakan or you're recently from China, you're under different pressures now. Pressures to be citizens of the new countries, become nationals of the new nations, whether or not to be Chinese, make decisions about whether to give it all up and return to China, or to accept local citizenship, become a national, or you still have one third. There was a third choice, which was to give up Southeast Asia altogether and find some other place where more tolerant of your being Chinese, like Australia, United States, Canada, or somewhere else, where you could escape from this pressure to become new nationals of these new states. To move to a more established nation state was easier than to be part of a very intense nation-building process, which they had to face. Now, I leave that one because that's a subject that would take me too far into something else. But let me go to the next point I want to make. In Francis Shi's book, most of the book was about this, about the family and ways of life, styles of life. And I think he makes one very interesting point, which obviously caught his eye, was that he had been in England, and so he was very interested in comparing the Americans, the Anglo-American, the British stock Americans, to the English. And he was very struck by how proud the Americans were that they were different from the English. So he made that point. Except he didn't make the same point about the Chinese. So I was sort of looking for whether he found the Chinese in America were very proud of being different from the Chinese in China. But that's not true, actually, as far as I know. More recent studies show that because of different circumstances, and here, of course, we have to say that in the case of the English, they actually settled, and America was an English country, so there was a difference. To be proud to be different from English was actually part of your revolution and your nation building, and that was a different, as it were, motivation for emphasizing the difference. Whereas Chinese, of course, had a very painful time, including in California, and they were kept very much as Chinese, but regarded as a sort of inferior brand of people, as it were, and they were very conscious of it. So I think maybe Francis Xi was sensitive to that. He just didn't want to talk about it, and he just left the subject. But the fact that he emphasized the difference between Americans and the English led me to wonder, why didn't he even notice that the Chinese and the Chinese back in China were probably closer? They didn't emphasize their difference. What he emphasized, I remember particularly interesting to me, was he emphasized the fact that the Americans strongly believed in the individual and self-reliance. I think the two words he used continually through the book, unlike the English. Because I didn't know much about the English at the time I read the book. I had not been to England yet. I didn't go until the year after. I didn't quite understand what he meant by that, but he made a big point about how the English still had quite a strong sense of family, although I found that is not quite so. But anyway, that's what he gave the impression. Whereas the American emphasis upon self-reliance and the individual was so much stronger that it caught his attention, and he spent a lot of time on it. But let me leave that. The last part of his book was interesting to me in another way, also caught my attention at the time, was he talked about communism. Because 1953, China had become communist, and up to that point, the Chinese Communist Party in China was still kind of reformist and not yet embarked on Mao Zedong's series of continuous revolutions. And so Francis, who still had his friends coming in from China, either via Taiwan or directly to China, was still conscious of how Chinese the revolution still was, and he wanted to emphasize that the Chinese are not really communist. The regime might be, but the people are not communist. And make this point. Now, he's talking about Chinese, not about China. At that time, of course, there had already been books about the United States and China by John King Fairbank, for example, wrote a very, very powerful and very much respected and widely read book called The United States and China. But that's talking about two countries, whereas he was talking about two peoples. And I thought that was interesting, at least to my mind was interesting. And he was emphasizing the people. And he emphasized the fact that the Chinese can't be communist. They're not communist. We now know, looking back now after many, many years, that he was right. But at the time, I don't think anybody really was very clear about that. If the Chinese Communist Party wins, the Chinese people must be communists. But he was very insistent they were not. And in a way, differentiating himself from what I think, one of the famous quotes from John King Fairbank was that, and that's been quoted against him too, and Fairbank had said that the Chinese people, of course he was referring to the leaders, that they were genuinely communist and at the same time genuinely Chinese. This was what I remember he'd been quoted on. So what that meant, I'm not sure. They can be both Chinese and communist, which I think is perfectly rational, reasonable statement to make. But Francis Xi's book would emphasize that they were really Chinese first, and that communism is nothing much, not to be taken too seriously. Now the context is very interesting because, as many of you more familiar than me, that was a time of McCarthyism. And it was a time when Professor Zhou Dang later on was to write about who lost China. I think there was a lot of books about that time, and blaming the people in the State Department, blaming communists in the Foreign Service, blaming communists everywhere in America, that there were American communists who were traitors and who had done damage to the American cause by sympathizing or failing to understand the communist nature of the Chinese people and so on. So there was all that around, and McCarthyism was very much reaching its peak at the point when Francis published his book. So I don't know to what extent he was influenced by that, but he refers to it when he talks about it in the last part of this communism part of it. So then that interests me because I was interested in this question of whether the Chinese are the enemy. It interested me because if you look at the whole history of US-China relations and the people of China and people of the United States, they've never been enemies. In fact, of all the Europeans, probably the most friendly towards the Chinese, at least by the standards of the time, were with the Americans. The Chinese had all sorts of resentments against the British, the French, and others, particularly about British and Russians and the Japanese later on. But they've never been hostile to the United States. There was a moment when the exclusion acts were publicized in China, when there was a bit of some demonstrations against the Americans, particularly against the Californians at that time. But it was never sustained. And if you look at the literature from the 1910s onwards, America was a very positive image in the minds of most Chinese. And so the idea of China or Chinese being an enemy, or the Americans being the enemy, I think was so new. So in that sense, it was again an exceptional phase in the relationship that for the first time, the word enemy was used in that context. Incidentally, Francis does not use the word, that's why I'm extrapolating here, because I'm looking for something to see why the feelings are so intense. Because although Francis doesn't use the word, when he describes what the Un-American Activities Committee was doing, or Joseph McCarthy was doing, Senator McCarthy was doing, very much like the enemy. Of course, you can say that the enemy were the communists, not the Chinese. But I think in terms of the popular press and so on, I don't think that distinction was very clear. So Francis was very determined to make that clear, that yes, the enemy might be the communists, but not the Chinese. And of course, at that point, this was all right, because it was fairly easy to show that the Chinese had, especially those who were with the Kuomintang, the people still had good memories of Song Mei-ling's trips around the United States, the very positive image of the Chinese fighting to save their country from the Japanese and so on. So that positive image was still around. So I think it was not so hard to say the Chinese can't be your enemies. In fact, your allies, your friends, and so many of those families of missionaries who have served in China had very positive images of what the Chinese people were like, how warm they were. And of course, I guess in the 50s, Pearl Buck was still widely read. I'm not sure how widely read she is today, but I think in the 50s she was still a very popular writer. And there was Lin Yutang, others writing in English, and he was in America. So the image of Chinese was still very positive at the time. So I think it was not so hard for Francis to communicate the idea that the Chinese are not the enemies. Communism is the enemy. But I think on the other side, on the American side, it's not so clear that these are really, can you separate China from the Chinese, as it were? And so I think that part, the McCarthyism part, brought up something, a little nastier image of the more negative image of the Chinese. But then that was never highlighted. And I mention that because I want to take it from there to say the Chinese as enemy was not entirely foreign to the Chinese. Those Chinese who felt they were treated as the enemy in the early days in the gold rush, that's one part. But in Southeast Asia, that's even more commonly recognized. They were the enemy for all sorts of reasons. They were the enemy because they were the collaborators with the Dutch or the English as rich, successful Chinese merchants who were partners of the English and the Dutch in their trading around the place, whereas the natives were treated as sort of third class. The whites at the top, the Chinese or foreign Orientals in between, and at the bottom of the heap were all the indigenous peoples, the native peoples. So that kind of consciousness was around almost throughout the certainly the archipelago region. Even in the Philippines, when Sino-mestizos or Chinese mestizos were still higher than the Filipinos, the native Filipinos. And above them, of course, would be the Spanish mestizos, and right above them were the pure Spaniards, as it were. So even there was an awareness that the Chinese are not with you, at least for the indigenous peoples. So that was very deep, and as far as I can tell, it goes back to 18th, 19th century. That says the consciousness that the Chinese were treated separately and at the expense of, at least that's how we saw it, at the expense of the locals. And you can still see the remnants of this even today. But so the Chinese treated as some kind of enemy, not of the Dutch, but of the indigenous peoples in the archipelago area anyway, dates back for quite a while. So the Chinese were not unfamiliar with the idea of being the enemy. But they, of course, had to live with it. They had all kinds of strategies to overcome it. They moved very freely among the indigenous people. They traded with them. They tried their best to do what they could to overcome this negative image. But as far as we can tell, down to the middle of the 20th century, it was a losing battle. Because when the time came and the Europeans left, the sense of the Chinese being some kind of enemy, if not, certainly not to be trusted and treated with great suspicion, that remained very strong, particularly in the archipelago areas. And then, of course, one can draw distinctions, and as I say, I don't want to go into all of that, but I would take two examples because they are the ones I'm most familiar with, and they're, again, exceptional areas. Exceptional because here, unlike everywhere else, where the Chinese were small minorities of 1 or 2 to 3% of the population, and that was the British Malaya. And British Malaya, up to, if you use the British definition of British Malaya included Singapore. If you included that, then the population at the time when I was a young man, the Chinese population was 50% of the population. That's British Malaya. If you take out Singapore, it was still something close to 40%. But if you include Singapore, it's 50%, plus more than 50%. So that was the reason why when the independence came along, the Malays insisted on keeping Singapore out, and the British were happy to keep Singapore as a colony, and the Federation of Malaya was established without Singapore. At least demographically, that made it more acceptable to the Malays. But these are exceptional areas. And I take it as British Malaya, and then of course they were separated, and I'll separate them now. Just one point in general. The general point is something that comes out of a study made at the time I think done with the British collaborating with the American security forces. They sent a very fine scholar, Lucien Pai, to do some interviews with the communists that the British had caught. The Malayan Communist Party had been fighting with the British in the Malayan emergency since 1948. And Lucien Pai was sent there in 1955 or thereabouts. And they had thousands of these. Incidentally, the British invented the term terrorists. We use it today for everybody who's Muslim, but in those days it was used for the Chinese in Malaya. That was what terrorists were Chinese. And they were the terrorists, or they call them CTs, communist terrorists. And so Lucien Pai interviewed them, and he came basically to the conclusion that they weren't communists. They didn't know anything about communism. They were responding to local circumstances for all sorts of reasons. He gives a whole list of different reasons. But the overall picture, let me just sum it up. The overall picture was they were not communists. In a way, emphasizing the point that Francis Xu had made about the Chinese not being communists. But in a very different context. Here were the members, supposedly, armed fighters fighting on behalf of the Malayan Communist Party, caught by the British, and Lucien Pai comes along and says, they're not communists. They're Chinese. Many of them were nationalists. They were patriots. They had joined the communists to fight the Japanese, and then they continued to fight the British because of the independence movement. They just wanted to have, as it were, a chance to take over an independent country after the British left, and so on. Now, I won't go into detail, but I just wanted to mention that just to show that even then the question of enemy, in the language of the Anglo-Malay upper classes, the ruling class of Malaya at the time, they were the enemy. without any doubt. That's why they were all in jail, why Lucian Pye was interviewing them. But with Lucian Pye saying that, actually the British released a lot of them afterwards. And because they also came to the conclusion that the vast majority of them were not. Now we have since then, a lot of studies have been made. More recently, there has been a whole spate of work done by the former members of the MCP. As you know, the Malayan Communist Party came to an agreement with the Malayan government, with both the Malaysian and the Thai government, and more or less surrendered. They refused to use the word, more or less surrendered, gave up their arms, and they are now located in villages in southern Thailand. Those are, I would say, if I can use the word, hardcore communists. They stayed right up to the bitter end. They fought among themselves on ideological grounds and so on and so forth. But what we have today is now, in the last 15 years or so, several dozens of their memoirs of what they did and how they joined and how they fought, including fighting among themselves, and how they followed the revolution in China, the Cultural Revolution, and how they fought their own battles and disagreements within the Malayan Communist Party, both in Malaya and in Thailand, both in Malaysia and in Thailand. So from the present work, I think it supports the Lucian Pye's arguments. Certainly, the bulk of them were not, but these are the remnants of it. And they're very small in number. They now occupy, all of them who surrendered, occupy about three or four villages in southern Thailand. The rest have been found to be totally uninvolved in communist ideology or thinking, and have been allowed to resume their Malaysian citizenship or Thai citizenship, and now living normal lives. In fact, these are the people who are now writing and publishing. They're publishing of all places, they're publishing in Kuala Lumpur, but those who are writing more controversial things, more delicate, sensitive matters, they're publishing in Hong Kong. But that's coming out, so that confirms a picture of the complexities of what is Chinese and what is communist, the sort of distinction that Francis was keen to make. I won't go into that in detail, but let me now go to the real exception. I said these were exceptional because there were large numbers of Chinese, but the real exception, of course, is obviously Singapore. It was never in the literature much before they became independent, but of course I lived through the period when Singapore was kicked out of Malaysia and became independent. It might be called a surprise nation. They were surprised themselves. I mean, Mr. Lee Kuan Yew was most surprised to find himself prime minister of a new country in 1965. I don't know whether in his heart he wanted it or not, we don't know, but certainly he was surprised to find himself running a country. And that was an exception in so many ways. The most obvious exception, as a fact, is the only country outside of Chinese territories which is run by a Chinese and run by a Chinese majority. 75% of population, even down to this day, it's still 75% of the population. But with always a Chinese leader, a party that's led by primarily Chinese, but always having non-Chinese members, that the People's Action Party. All their parties are non-ethnic, as it were, open to others, all Singaporeans. But exceptional in that sense, yes, but exceptional in so many other ways as well, because it was successful. There was another thing that was surprised. Not all colonies are successful, as you know. British colonies have been known to have done pretty badly after the British left. Well, Singapore is one of the exceptions. It's done extraordinarily well. It's done better than when it was run by the British. I think probably the only one that one can say, only British former territory that has done better after the British left, and that is Singapore. So that's an exceptional. Other exception one can argue, another one I thought was interesting, because when Singapore was fighting this battle with Malaysians and so on, one of the biggest arguments against Singapore being allowed to be independent on its own by both the British and the Malays, who were not very keen on Singapore being independent, was that they were convinced that the Chinese were communists, and that Singapore would become communist if they were allowed to be independent, like Cuba off the coast of America, something like that. An analogy was made. it took a long while for the British and the Malay upper classes to believe that Lee Kuan Yew was not a communist, that his People's Action Party was not communist. And therefore, it was quite safe to leave it in their hands. Now, the reason for that, again, very interesting, because it goes back to the earlier period that I mentioned about the local born and the newcomers from China. Because that was what it was, the big political fight in Singapore was between those who were local born, who really identified with Singapore and nowhere else because they didn't belong anywhere else, and the vast majority of the Chinese who went to Chinese schools, educated in Chinese, spoke Chinese all the time, and who identified with Chinese politics, were nationalistic about China, who also wanted to see an independent Singapore in which they would be in charge. But they were the majority. And here were the British leaving Singapore behind as a democratic country, practicing the kind of British democracy that they left every colony with. And how could someone like Lee Kuan Yew, who was fifth generation Chinese, and almost all his top party leaders and his colleagues were mainly local born, with a few exceptions, mainly local-born Chinese, deal with this majority who are Chinese educated. Now, in a way, the whole story of Singapore politics, from then even till this day, is hinged on this question of how this local lot, who are, if I may use an analogy with American terms, would be the loyalists winning against the revolutionaries, say in 1786 or 1770s onwards, that the loyalists won instead of the revolutionaries, because in a sense that was what happened. The loyalists, the loyal to the British colonial state, as it were, and for their own interest, they were not particularly fond of the British, but they had been educated out of their Chinese framework in English schools, accepted in the British system, understanding the British legal system and bureaucratic system, knowing how to, in fact, inherit the colonial state. They fought with the help of the British and the Malays in Malaya. With their help, they won. And the loyalists won. But of course, similarly, I think in America, the analogy could be true. If the British who supported the loyalists had helped them win the battle, the whole history of America might be very different. But in the case of Singapore, the loyalists won. Instead of running off to Canada, they ran the place, as it were. And then they, against most predictions at the time, I remember I was in Kuala Lumpur at the time, against most predictions, they succeeded. As I mentioned earlier on, that was pretty exceptional for a colony. And in order to survive, one of the first things they had to do was try not to be an enemy of anybody. And that's one of the reasons for its success, for Singapore's success, is to try and befriend everybody. When you're small, weak, indefensible, you might say. Incidentally, I might add that when Lee Kuan Yew became Prime Minister, he didn't have one single soldier. Singapore did not have one single soldier. The whole army was either British or Malay. And he had to build his army from nothing and recruiting Chinese who didn't like to join the army to be the armed forces. And then he did something also exceptional. I think, again, I'm not sure if this is true today, but till this day, it's the only country, a Chinese country anyway, a Chinese majority country, which has national service. Every Singaporean male does 2 years to 2.5 years national service. Only the males, indeed. A lot of questions about why not the girls, but only the males. But that's exceptional. Singapore did that because they needed an armed forces, because they didn't have any, but they also needed it to use it as a nation-building process. And that way, in the armed forces, you build the new nation. Make everybody feel that they're Singaporean. Now remember that I mentioned the challenge that they had. The loyalists won. They had to spend, as it were, the last 30, 40 years to make sure that the majority who were fighting against them could become Singaporeans. And national service was one of the means of doing that. Changing the education system, getting rid of all the Chinese schools and turning them into English schools, English medium schools, all that was part of the strategy of winning them over to the loyalist point of view and building a nation at the same time. Now, these are very odd things for any Chinese to do anyway. And they have never done it before, to my knowledge, in the whole of Chinese history. So that's an exceptional. I know we take Singapore for granted now. They just everybody talks about Singapore as a kind of successful example of a little state, ex-colony, and so on. But when you look at it, it's actually very exceptional. And not because I lived there instantly, and instantly I'm not a Singaporean. So I think I can speak a little bit more objectively. But let me just end this particular point by saying that one of the reasons for their success was that because they were loyalists and they were the minority, they never let the Chinese majority determine the nature of the state. They insisted on the colonial state as inherited from the British, but run by the loyalists, but successfully adapting it to satisfy some of the demands of the Chinese educated majority to make them gradually accept the new Singapore nation as their home. And this is quite some doing. And if you look at the whole process of it, really it was both painful for everybody concerned. It meant using all kinds of methods, what you would definitely call non-democratic methods. In fact, they were exceptional in one sense. They were given a democracy which they had to adapt to become less and less democratic in order to succeed as a democracy. Because there's a kind of a paradox there. Because they have actually practiced a democracy. Every 5 years they've had elections, they've gone through democratic processes. On the surface, it's actually observing all the key points about the democratic system that they inherited from Britain. But insofar as they controlled and manipulated the whole system in order to defend the colonial state that they had inherited, they had to do all sorts of other things to make sure that this could work. And they were very efficient. They did so by being extra efficient, very conscientious, very practical, and Lee Kuan Yew's biggest boast would be almost totally incorruptible in the civil service. Quite exceptional again, at least for a former colony. And for almost any country in Asia, I might say, very few countries like that. And in the end, they were open. Today, what is extraordinary about Singapore, it is open to migration again. They had a phase where they stopped immigration of anybody. They just wanted to make sure that whoever were there would become nationals of Singapore and become Singaporean. But after they're being more and more successful, since the 1990s, they've been opening up for all sorts of reasons, wanting to be a global city, wanting to perform bigger roles in the world. The more successful they got, the more involved they were in the whole international global networks, the more global they were, the more open they had to be at all levels. And today, for example, the population of the foreign-born in Singapore is nearly a third of the population are foreign-born. And at least 1/4 are actually not Singapore citizens. So that's the ratio. But they're still opening up. In fact, right now, it is the biggest political issue in Singapore today, is the question of immigration. In other words, it's become a normal country. What is it about immigrants? That's quite an extraordinary change compared to the time when Singapore started. And one of the most famous speeches by Lee Kuan Yew when the country was established in 1965 was say, "We are a nation of migrants, immigrants." Today, we are Singaporeans with a immigration policy. So it's been redefined. But at the same time, they have actually adopted quite consistently a policy which would match those of the United States, Canada, Australia, and New Zealand, the Anglophone countries which are originally migrant states, all of them built by migrants. Singapore has modeled itself on that. It prides itself on being a migrant state, the only one in the whole of Asia which is a migrant state, and that it has this openness is the argument it uses to develop itself, and the model is the American model. And this comes out in so many other ways. It's quite extraordinary. So the stages of Singapore's development is a story of a whole range of exceptional things done by people of Chinese descent outside of China. I just sum it up that way and leave that. And come to my final point about, going beyond, this one has nothing to do with Francis Xu, I can't blame him for this one, about the world going global and China going global. And today we're looking at countries now. When the Chinese found it useful to take up the word exceptionalism, I thought that was worth noting. They took it from the Americans. American exceptionalism, which the Chinese never understood before, but recently they got interested in it. Now they have translated that into 特殊论, and there's several essays about 特殊论, using the American example. Exactly what they have in mind is not clear, because the American use of exceptionalism also has different contexts. But the one that has caught the world's attention anyway is when America says that these are international practices, but it doesn't apply to America. We're the exception. Now that, of course, is a debatable issue that many people who are experts on international law have written about, and I don't know much about it except what I have read from them. But my understanding is that this has been the most frequent use of the word exceptionalism in modern times. And the Chinese have picked that up. If the Americans are exceptional in some ways, so are we. But then they've developed it because they've just taken a word, as I have done, without the backdrop of how the Americans use it in international law, taken the word exceptional to talk about Chinese civilization, Chinese culture, or as Francis Xu would say, the Chinese family, Chinese kinship system, exceptional. So the Chinese have now taken that word up. I don't think they've developed it yet into any kind of a sophisticated framework, but the fact that they're attracted to this also caught my attention. So I want to end on this one, when we talk now not of Chinese and Americans, but of China and America. And of course, this has many, many challenges behind it. I mean, people have talked about G2, from the American scholars have suggested a G2 partnership between China and America. That's at the very positive end. At the other end, of course, China and the United States ultimately would have to be rivals or competitors and possibly even enemies. These are the two extremes, partners or ultimately, potentially, future enemies. These are the dichotomies which are now with us. But the background, it seemed to me, is interesting. Let me just briefly go through that. The fact is, America is a global power. It has been a global power, particularly since after the Second World War. And it is global in a comprehensive way. It is in every respect global. But is China global? Now for China today, the PRC anyway, for the PRC today, to be global is still a very new experience. They're not sure what it means to be global and what are the responsibilities of being global, what does it mean to be global, except that they now have to buy their resources from all over the world. That's about the only way in which they are actively being global. Other than that, they operate in United Nations, they have embassies everywhere, but that's really superficial. And they have, incidentally, not so superficial, they now have Confucius Institutes everywhere as well. So that's pretty widespread. But ultimately, it's still very new to the Chinese. I don't know how many Chinese think much about being a global power. But the word has been applied. America and many other countries look to China, look upon China as, if not yet a global power, it will eventually be a global power. So what does global mean? My understanding, and here's where I go back to a little bit of history again, my understanding is global is maritime. I sum it up in that way. And all of human history that is on record anyway, the recorded history that we had in the past was all about the activities on the combined continents of Eurasia, but also a bit of North Africa. I mean, the sub-Saharan Africa is not mentioned much, but North Africa, Europe, and Asia has been where our recorded history has been mainly about until very recent times, until, in fact, the peopling of the Americas. So Eurasia is really the history of most of humankind on record, and certainly for the Chinese. The Chinese have always been part of that Eurasia. But you look at the Eurasia of the time, the heartland of Eurasia was right in the middle, so to speak, but there were outliers. China was an outlier. India was an outlier, and so was Western Europe. Western Europe was also an outlier. If you look at the heartland being the heartland of Eurasia, these were outliers. But it is very interesting that almost all these civilizations that we identify have been among the outliers. And one of them has one interesting difference from the others. The Chinese and Indian outliers developed their own civilization, but never went to the sea, because it was the ocean, too mysterious, too dangerous, and on the whole they shied away from the sea, and they looked very much to the continent where all the enemies came from. All of Chinese history, I think, is familiar with anyone who knows Chinese history. All the enemies came from overland. And similarly with India. India had no enemies to speak of at sea until the arrival of Vasco da Gama. No enemies at sea. All the enemies, in fact, came through what is today still the most vulnerable part of India, which is the Khyber Pass, from Afghanistan to Pakistan to Peshawar into India. Always been, for centuries, right from the beginning of the Indo-European, so-called Aryan peopling of North India. It's always come from overland. Similarly in Europe, all the enemies have also come from overland, from Russia, Central Asia, Persia, even from way back from earliest Greek history, you talk about them coming from Eurasia. But there's one difference, if I may use the word exceptional again. The exceptional is that they had the sea, they had the Mediterranean. Neither the other two outliers had any dealings with the sea. But you look at European history, the most classic victories were at sea. Of course, there were some land ones as well, but classic victories were at sea, the Mediterranean Sea. So why I emphasize this is because that outlier developed a culture that worked both land and sea, in a way that was not true of China and India. I underline this because what happened was, to me, the whole modern world, global world, began by people going out to sea and crossing the oceans. And they started with the Portuguese on the edge of Europe. In fact, I keep on having to remind myself that the Portuguese didn't even have access to the Mediterranean. They were outside of the Mediterranean, and they had no choice but to go out to the ocean. And of course, the Dutch and the British also had no access to the Mediterranean. If they had to have any naval power at all, they had to be dealing with the ocean, the sea. And the Dutch were the first to do so, with the help of the Spanish and the Portuguese after Columbus. It was when the Dutch was still part of the Spanish Netherlands. They had this connection with the ocean-going Spanish armadas and so on. So the Dutch were the first. The British, of course, were quick to follow. And ultimately, as we know, the British naval forces became the most successful of them all. And they were what made the difference between what had been previous history and today what we call global history. Of course, it started with the Portuguese, the Spanish, the Dutch, and the French joined in later. But ultimately, it was the British Empire that made history global. And the Americans inherited the British Empire. Not the land, but inherited the naval traditions of that global maritime history that I believe is the key to what is global. Now, if that is true, and I think one cannot talk of other things, technology has taken us to the air, to cyberspace, to internet and so on, but I think that is for the future, and I don't know. But right now, up to now, and up to the foreseeable future, global is still depends on maritime power, and that was count. And then you look at China. China could have had a navy. Yes, we all know about Zheng He. We all know about the fact that from the Song dynasty onwards, they were beginning to develop a naval force. But they had it, and they threw it away. They gave it up. Of no importance. They decided that the enemies were coming from overland. They never really needed a navy. They destroyed it, in fact. and they never looked at the sea again seriously thereafter. It was not until the 19th century when, for the first time, and this, back to the word exceptional in Chinese history, came a few British ships and opened up China. And from then onwards, of course, China was vulnerable at sea. Even then, they took them, I would say, they took them about 5 decades to wake up to the fact that the sea was a determinant factor in the future of China. And it took them that long because it was not until they were defeated by the Japanese at the end of the 19th century that they realized that the sea was that important. And by that time, it was a bit late. And they never really built up a navy afterwards, because soon after that, the Qing fell. The Republic was hopelessly divided, civil wars within the country, and they had no capacity to build much of a navy. Bought a few ships here and there, trained a few sailors. But if you look at what the Chinese Navy was like throughout the 1920s, 30s, and 40s, I have to say it was pretty pathetic. And one can just be reminded to simply say that the People's Liberation Army won totally on land. When they won in 1949, they didn't have a single ship. Sorry, they had 1 or 2 which surrendered from the Kuomintang. They're all American ships, incidentally, second-hand American cruisers and gunboats, which the Kuomintang had, but the commanders surrendered to the communists, and that was their first ship. And they never really managed to build up a navy because if you look at the whole of the Cold War, down to 1990s, to the end of the Cold War, every single naval power was allied against communism. Russia had no navy to speak of. I think I can think of no communist country that had a navy to speak of. So all that period, China was locked up in their continental thing, thinking about the navy, but having nowhere to train. Because if you remember, even in the 19th century, when they wanted to start a modern navy, they asked the British to train them, and the British turned them down. The British trained the Japanese instead. And the Chinese were forced to turn to the French to train their navy in the Fuzhou Naval Shipyard. It was the French who trained them. Well, I guess the French had a navy, once upon a time, but they were no match for the British, and that showed very well in the Sino-Japanese War of 1894, when the British-trained Japanese Navy swiped clear, as it were, clean, the French-trained Chinese Navy. I don't blame the French or the British, incidentally. I'm just saying, as a matter of fact, that was the tragic consequence of that. And the tragedy continues. The Chinese had nobody to train them for a navy, even to this day. They have actually basically have done it themselves. And it's very slow, hard work, because with a great naval tradition going back to the Mediterranean and then crossing the Atlantic, as I say, I've tried to make something of it, that the second Mediterranean was the Atlantic, when the Europeans on the edges of the outlier Western Europe turned to the Atlantic, crossed it, and at the same time crossed into the Pacific and the Indian Ocean. The Portuguese came around this way, the Spanish went the other way, and then it became global. As I say, global because it was maritime power. And so the Pacific and the Indian Ocean becomes, as it were, Mediterranean 3. Actually, it's not Mediterranean, but I'm just for the sake of expanding the metaphor a bit. But the Chinese have watched all this happen without being able to counter it. So for the first time that I can think of, an exceptional decision was made to seriously build a navy, was really in the 1990s. I mean, I can't quite pin down the exact date because there's some discussions about when because Deng Xiaoping had said, keep the military costs down. Don't spend too much on armaments and so on. But a decision was made under Jiang Zemin. Exactly which date, I'm not sure, but it was in the mid-1990s when the decision was made that the Navy must be given a lot more money and take it seriously, build a Navy. So ever since then, of course, the idea of a Chinese Navy has frightened everybody to death. I mean, especially in my neighborhood in Southeast Asia. Everybody talks of the Chinese Navy as if it was some horrendous, horrific thing. But to be quite honest, the Chinese don't have much of a navy. It's starting, it's trying to do something. I don't think the Chinese know how to think in naval terms yet. I may be wronging them, so they may be very angry with me for saying that, but I really don't think that comes normally to them. They're struggling to think about what is naval power. They will learn, and I'm sure they will get better as time goes on. But right now, to talk of the Chinese Navy as being a threat to anybody is, I'm afraid, a little premature. And as far as the US Navy is concerned, it's just a joke, frankly. And I think that the US Navy knows it very well. And they're not a bit frightened. But nevertheless, you can see, if you read the op-eds and the commentaries and so on, you think that the Chinese Navy is now about to rule the world. One thing I can say, though, it is true, their merchant navy is probably the largest in the world. And that's because they need it to buy their coal or iron or whatever the ship. They don't want to depend entirely on foreign shipping. So they have built up their merchant navy and they ship their own goods out. So the merchant navy is very, very strong. But the merchant navy is unarmed. It needs protection. And right now they are, quite frankly, free riding on the American navies, protecting the sea lanes so that Chinese merchant ships can travel safely, bringing the important, crucial, essential, vital things to China and the vital goods they send out to sell. So they're actually doing very well with the American Navy on their side. So I don't see the Chinese in any way wanting to change that. That's a tremendous advantage to the Chinese, and they want to keep it that way. So I spend a few minutes on this one because I want to end by talking about how it affects, how it's related to the Chinese outside, this global business. If China goes global, and it is a global world we're talking about, then the Chinese have a different position in the world. They are now, as nobody knows exact numbers because it's very hard to count who is Chinese anymore. But broadly speaking, we are content to use the figure of something like 40 million people of Chinese descent or Chinese origin around the world. But I can't tell you whether it is exact or not. They include all those from 6, 7 generations outside all the way down to the recent arrivals. And lots of the recent arrivals haven't been counted because some of them are not yet settled anywhere. They still hold Chinese passports, and we're not sure how to count them. So all these terminologies, why people argue about terminology, is quite important because the old days we talked about the Huaqiao, and I didn't mention the word, but I was talking about Huaqiao during that period when the Chinese government took an interest in the Chinese overseas and called them Huaqiao, Chinese who are temporarily resident abroad. But now we've abandoned that for most of the Chinese who are born outside with taken foreign nationalities and citizenships. We use the word, the Chinese use the word 海外华人. They still use the word overseas Chinese, but overseas Chinese used to translate Huaqiao. Now they translate it more literally, 海外华人. Quite, it is probably irrelevant, but nevertheless, it's interesting they use 海外 because, again, it's maritime. It's the sea, people who went out by sea, because that's not significant. Anyway, 海外华人 now is not good enough now. The Chinese have great trouble with that. Because what about all those Chinese who are coming out here? There are probably some in the audience here who are out from China and may or may not stay. I mean, it's not by no means clear. So the Chinese, 侨办, have invented the term 新移民. Again, to avoid Huaqiao, because that's a controversial term. 海外华人 doesn't describe everybody, so they have used the word 新移民 to separate those from the 海外华人, those who are settled or have taken local nationalities or PRs or whatever, but the rest are 新移民. But even then, it's so blurred. I've asked the people in Beijing how do they decide who is 新移民 and who is not, and they are themselves not very clear, and they don't want to be too clear because it's very awkward for them. So I think they rather leave it like that. But it's interesting that the terminology is changing because it also reflects this global nature of it all. All those old terms don't quite apply. I could go on, but let me just try and draw it to a close in this way. What was exceptional about it was from the very beginning that the idea of looking at the Chinese abroad seriously was in a way invented by the Chinese government. Incidentally, not by the communists, not by the Kuomintang, but by the Qing dynasty. Now, for a country that had for centuries, from the Ming and the Qing period, had a ban on overseas, on traveling overseas, on Chinese traveling overseas, and the ban was not officially lifted until 1893. But by the same time they lifted the ban, they also set up a whole number of officers within different ministries, as they set up the ministries, to look into Huaqiao affairs. The term Huaqiao was invented at roughly the same time that the ban was lifted in 1893. We argue about when the Huaqiao was first used, whether it was just before that or just after that, but it was about that time. And the reason was because they were consciously then having a policy to recruit the Huaqiao to help modernize China, either because they were very wealthy and successful, as in Southeast Asia, or because, as in America and elsewhere, they had technical knowledge, new technological understanding of the West, knowledge of the West, know Western languages, know something about Western values and Western modernity to help China, to speed up China's modernization process. Of course, they were already aware of this through the treaty ports. All the 5 treaty ports and more treaty ports had been opened up by that time. They were aware of this. But to have the Chinese out there learning some more and bringing them back to China was something that they, for the first time, recognized. That is exceptional for Chinese history. It was exceptional throughout the world. No other government that I know had set up an official policy to look after their overseas citizens in the way the Chinese did. And eventually it became refined, structured, better structured, and by the time the Kuomintang came to power in 1928, it had become a major branch of the government. And interestingly enough, the internationalist communists, when they came in 1949, continued with it and actually used it very effectively to try and bring in foreign exchange, bring in foreign talent, bring in foreign knowledge to help the modernization and the industrialization and ultimately the wealth and power of China. That was part of it all. To have done that from the Qing dynasty onwards, I checked this and I can't find any other government in the world that had a policy like that. And what I find even more extraordinary, if not exceptional, that it was continued by all the regimes thereafter. There's a continuity there which, again, really takes my breath away. Why did they continue? It was not. Why did the Republic of China inherit that policy and continue with it? And the Kuomintang enhanced it, and the PRC strengthened it even more. In fact, when the PRC strengthened the Chaoban, the Taiwan still had its Chaowu, and they were rivals in competing for the loyalty of the Chinese overseas. And the one country where they were competing most openly and more consistently was the United States. Almost everywhere else, the Taiwan Chaowu fell back, except in the United States because of American policy towards the PRC. So it was American policy and American society that allowed this very exceptional rivalry between the two branches of the overseas Chinese officers of two countries to operate freely and actively compete for the hearts and souls of the Chinese, as it were, in America. That's also pretty exceptional. Again, I don't know of any other country that has successfully sustained a policy like that anywhere else in the world. So, and that's exceptional also partly because America is exceptional, because it is the only country that has allowed it and even encouraged it all this time, which is quite extraordinary to me as a complete outsider on this one. So I think I end on that note, except to simply say this, and my final point. When China was very strong, what kind of policy did it have about the Chinese overseas? The answer is nothing. They didn't care. The whole of the period when the Chinese were coming out and trading in Southeast Asia and elsewhere, through Song, Yuan, Ming, Qing, the governments didn't care. In fact, they were illegal. They were not supposed to be there, and there were all kinds of punishments for them to come back. Even as late as the early 20th century, I remember And that was my first time I was in Berkeley in 1960. I went to the library and saw some of the local newspapers, the Zhongsha-Yatbo, I think it was called. It was published locally. And there were accounts of, at least I remember seeing them, reports on how the Chinese from America going back to China were punished in one way or the other by the local officials, either by taxing them more, forcing them to pay bribes and do all sorts of things, and generally exploiting them for having been overseas. Now, the exact causes are not explained, but I remember I caught my attention. I still remember that vividly, because that was the first time I saw so many accounts of, in fact, reports in the Zhongsha-Yatbo warning Chinese Americans what to look out for when they go back to their villages from the officials. And that was as late as that. So the Chinese are not exactly caring for the Chinese overseas. No policy as such. Even though there was a sort of Chaowu established, it was still very feeble and not really strengthened until later on. So when China was strong, nothing. When China was weak, and that was when the Qing dynasty invented the whole Huaqiao policy. I say invented because there was nothing like that in the past. And as I said, to my amazement, it has been sustained for more than 100 years as a policy to keep in touch with the Huaqiao and then Haiwai Huaren and now Xinyimin, to keep in touch and keep them close to China. And exactly what the relationship, of course, varied tremendously from time to time, from government to government, from different communities of Chinese to another. Many variations. But that connection, however, was established then, when China was weak. Very strong when it was weak. And now that China is beginning to be strong again, what will happen to their Chaowu, Chaoban kind of activities? So I end with a question mark. And this goes back to all the question of Chinese, the link with China, the Chineseness that either kept the family going in one way or the other or not, the Chinese who are trying hard not to be an enemy or cannot help being an enemy, and finally the Chinese as part of the global modernization, globalization process, their usefulness to a China that's becoming strong again. How would that play out ultimately? I do not know, but I will end with that thought in your mind. Thank you very much.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you very much. So we have about 20 minutes for our session left, and we will begin with two sets of brief remarks for responding remarks. The first one by Professor Penelope Edwards, who is a historian and then also chair of our Department of South and Southeast Asian Studies. Please.
Thank you, once again. And I will keep these brief because I know many people will want to ask Professor Wang Gungwu questions. And of course, his talk was no exception in its breadth and depth and its approach to the situation and positioning of China and Chinese globally. And I wanted just to make a couple of comments tying back into where you finished your talk. And one of those comments relates to the fact that really it was only until 1893, it was almost impossible to be globally Chinese. One could only be locally Chinese because there was this very strong notion that those Chinese who had left China were actually not anymore Chinese. They'd abandoned their place in the ancestral cosmos. They'd relinquished their obligations, filial obligations to tend to the ancestral graves, and they were renounced as deserters and traitors and pirates and so forth. And so when in the Philippines in the 17th century, in Java in the 18th century, the governments oversaw massacres of local Chinese populations, actually the Chinese Empire, Gungwu, was really not very interested and almost implicitly condoned those acts. And then after 1893, of course, there was this recognition, and thank you for pointing out that this was actually revolutionary for the time globally, for China to be setting up this Huaqiao office. And then in 1909, you have in the last sort of years of the Qing dynasty, there's a rearticulation of the Chinese nationality law, and there's a reconfiguration away from boredom from the earth, from the territory, and to be born in China is what makes you Chinese. To stay in China, unless you have the official dispatch of the authorities and you are sent off to Cambodia, for example, like Zhou Daguan in the 13th century, and you're therefore licit. To stay in China is how one retains and remains Chinese. And 1909, we have this shift to the jus sanguinis, to the bloodline law. And then we have these categories of Hua Qiao, Hua Yi, Hua Ren, and then more recently this Hai Wai Hua Ren. And Wang Gungwu has really pioneered the scholarship of Chinese as diaspora and has questioned the use of the term diaspora. And I think one of the exceptions that your talk points to in recent decades, after various attempts by the Chinese government to contain and channel and marshal movements of Chinese capital, among other things, back into China, as well as a very tight regime controlling the mobility of Chinese with bans on travel, certainly during long periods of the People's Republic of China, where there was very tight controls on travel outwards. There is this sense now, or rather what's exceptional now, I think perhaps, is that we have Chinese, and often through these families, and you started off with the unit of the family, who are moving towards a sort of a sense of re-aspora. So you have Chinese moving out to Southeast Asia, often then after times of turmoil in Cambodia, Indonesia, and elsewhere, perhaps finding third countries. And then we have the accumulation of wealth in particular instances, and the desire now among some Chinese to return to China, and among some Chinese who had then settled onward in third countries, whether it's Canada or Australia or France, to return to Chinese communities in Southeast Asia. And so this notion of the adversarial relationship, and you talked about enemy in China as enemy and adversary, well, yes, historically, right up to 1893, the Chinese overseas was sort of almost in an adversarial position with the Chinese government in China. So I just wanted to point to those tensions a little bit, and really I have many other things that I look forward to discussing with you later this evening, but I really don't want to monopolize this very precious time where each of you will want to listen to the comments of my colleague Aiwa Ong and then engage Professor Wang Gungwu in further discussion. So thank you very much, and look forward to further discussion.
And Aiwa, please, Professor of Anthropology.
Right. Well, thanks for your patience. I'm a member of the group called Straits Chinese, and also I'm an American, Asian American, and now, right. So for me, for people like me, the being Chinese is always a rather fuzzy and contingent kind of thing. And in fact, I have lots of nieces in Singapore where they're now undergoing a re-Sinicization, where in fact they're all required, to study Chinese in a kind of artificial way of being reconstituted as Chinese subjects. But I can tell you that my very brilliant nieces and nephews, they learn Chinese, but they speak English, okay? They think of learning Chinese as just one more chore of being imposed upon them by national policy. So I want to just make the point that, in fact, Professor Wang Gungwu his work has been extremely foundational to our understanding of contemporary Chinese studies, and really, really very fruitful. But as an anthropologist, I want to trouble the uses of the terms Chineseness and exceptionalism, trouble them in a sense to establish that they are useful categories, but they are also rather unstable categories. But I take it that is a very important point, that these categories have become they are co-articulating today in some kind of critical relationship that is at stake, I think, in the rise of China in the age of globality. So the first point I want to make is that, in fact, modern Chinese categories are all powerfully mediated by a variety of authorizations, a variety of judgments, a variety of discourses, and academic knowledges, as you said, that in fact there's no single agreed upon term called Chinese, and also mediated by many different languages, by Chinese dialect, by Mandarin, by English terms. So if you want to say something that's Chinese, it's never a stable, and it's never always the same reference. In your very rich and complex historical account, Professor Wang, you talked about imperial terms, PRC nationalist terms of Chineseness, cultural references of Chineseness, colonial labels of Chineseness. It was very interesting in Malaysia. Initially, the Chinese were labeled with the Indians as aliens. And then also, of course, the kind of forms of self-identification by people at a local level. So in other words, the term Chineseness varies in time and space and at different scales. And very often, since the colonial period, the term has become, as Professor Wang said, has emerged as a kind of target of exception. So that is a very, very useful way of thinking about exception. Why exception, the category exception, is in a sense appended to understandings of Chineseness today. And you use the term exception in two ways. One as a form of positive self-othering. Well, we Chinese come from a brilliant civilization. We Chinese are whatever. So and then on the other hand, there's also a kind of Orientalist construction of the Chinese as being somewhat exceptional, But most of your talk, I think, move away from this kind of self-congratulatory representation or form of collective self-abstraction to emphasize what the reason why we think about the Chinese in terms of exceptionalism is because they have consistently, in the modern period, been the target of policies of exception. In other words, that exception as a political act. So in British Malaya, and before the British arrived, the Portuguese, the Spanish, they thought the Chinese were exceptional because they were so damn hardworking and cunning in comparison to the so-called lazy natives. So the immediate sorting out of the variety of populations that Europeans encountered, and then the interest in making use of them in different ways. And of course, you talked about in the United States, the Chinese being treated as a kind of enemy, but in fact, even before the Cold War, the Chinese arrivals were already considered real threats of a different kind, economic threats, because they were, especially on the West Coast, Chinese immigrants were considered scabs who threatened the jobs of the Irish working classes. So in a sense, you could say that the modern history of the Chinese within Southeast Asia and in the West have been in many ways constructed out of a series of exceptions by the authorities. And then I just want to make the final point, which is about, you're gesturing towards the kind of re-emergence of a kind of new kind of Chinese exceptionalism that is perhaps instantiated, you think, by Singapore's enormous success. So here is, again, it's a form of self-representation and also representation by the business media that China is Singapore is extremely successful. And but you seem to also suggest, although you focus a lot on, China or the Beijing view of things today, you seem to be suggesting that, in a sense, Singapore represents a kind of successful China in the periphery, a peripheral China, that could, in a sense, provide useful lessons for this emerging China as it tries to be a global power. Thank you.
If you would like either to respond or maybe to take a few questions.
I think I'll take questions first and then see what...
All right, so questions from the floor, please. All right, please.
Professor Xu, I recall it was a few decades back when I attended something like this and was argued that communism fits Chinese culture. The emphasis on the group, the collectivism, and all the rest of it. And but it appears, beginning with Professor Francis Xu, that, if you will, that's an exception. That's exceptional. So what makes me curious is, what if the Chinese were communists? How would that show up? How would you know? What would you look for?
Well, in the strictest terms, you ask whether they follow the teachings of Marx, Lenin, Stalin, and so on. If you take that as a narrow definition, then I would say there are very, very few Chinese I know who do that. I think probably of the three that I mentioned, Marx probably still has some readers and still some thinkers, but neither Stalin nor Lenin has much of a place in the cosmology of Chinese thinking today. And it would be very hard to argue that all the members of the Chinese Communist Party are communists. In fact, I happen to know that many members of the Chinese Communist Party who are not interested in communism at all, they are interested in being Chinese. And so that turns it the other way around. So when you say that communism fits Chinese, which is one way of looking at it, it's that communism is a useful tool, an instrument for becoming Chinese again, by unifying the country, by defeating the enemy, by asserting Chinese power once again to recreate a kind of Chinese which will be respected by the rest of the world. So they made use of communism successfully. But that's another way of looking at it. So, but in no way have they committed themselves to communism. They have found it a useful instrument by the way it organized the Leninist political party, the way they organized the war against the civil war against Kuomintang, against the nationalists. But they were actually pretty nationalistic. If you look at what they actually were doing and saying, all of them were pretty nationalistic while they're opposing the nationalists. But then they would say the nationalists are not good nationalists, and they weren't successful. We are the real nationalists. By using communism successfully, we have become the leaders of a new China that every Chinese could be proud of. So in that sense, communism is a very useful instrument of reaching it. But to say that they're communists, pretty difficult. I wouldn't know how to describe that.
That's one more question from the floor, and then I would ask you to address the remarks from Penny and Ira. One more question from the floor? Not really? Yes? No? Okay. So from Penny and Iowa, I think.
Yeah, thank you very much for your comments. I'll take them back and ponder over many of them. I thought that Penny was quite right to emphasize the fact that before 1893 there was no legal position for the Chinese in China at all. Once you're out of China, you're really out of sight. And the most striking ones, you mentioned the two massacres, were very interesting. Many people have tried to look through the Chinese sources to see whether the Chinese imperial government had any knowledge of or cared at all what happened in Batavia and in Manila. There's some reference, very brief references to the fact that they knew it happened. So they can't say that they were ignorant if it happened. They knew it happened, but did absolutely nothing about it. That's definite. The interesting thing is that when this matter arose again in 1997, 98 in Indonesia, when the Chinese women were raped and there was a great deal of killing of Chinese in that changeover from Suharto's power. I happened to be in Jakarta at the time, and the Chinese embassy was really on the spot for that one. And here's a very different situation. And yet, on the spot because all those Chinese who were killed were Indonesian citizens. And they, as officially, the Chinese government couldn't do anything about it. But the blogs, the outside, everywhere in the Chinese, the overseas Chinese particularly, but even in China, but they didn't hear about it till much later. But overseas Chinese in America, in Malaysia, Singapore, Philippines, and so on, their response was, why don't you do something about it? Why isn't the Chinese government protesting or saying something to the Indonesian government about the killing of Chinese? So there was you can see, and this comes back to Iowa's point about what is Chinese. The word is a terrible word, and I confess to being using it in so many different senses all the time. I can't help it. But it just goes to show, what did it mean to be Chinese? Everybody outside of China said the Chinese government should do something. The Chinese being killed there, and the overseas Chinese were responding very furiously about it. But the Chinese government couldn't say a word. It took them months, I think, before they finally made some general protest about being, the government of Indonesia should ensure law and order, that people should do all the right things. But they couldn't identify those people killed as Chinese. They couldn't use it. They took it very literally. In fact, they were in that way more correctly using international standards to say that they're not Chinese citizens. You cannot do anything. They cannot say anything about it. So that goes to show how difficult it is. And it takes me again to Aihua's very, very important question about the word Chinese. Of course, as we know, in the Chinese language, there is no equivalent, really, of the word Chinese. We have used some words to translate the word Chinese, but outside of China, there's only one word for Chinese, as far as I know. The only difference is that the Russians call us Kitai. And that's because they have a different perspective. And they use Kitai because of the Khitans. And they use that from way back. But everybody else, the word is Chinese. There's only one word for every variety of Chinese you can think of. There's only one word in English. So what do? So we find adjectives. And you find, again, there are myriads of adjectives. You say American Chinese or Chinese American. You find some way of describing, because otherwise the word Chinese doesn't tell you very much. And so I plead guilty because all of us get caught with this problem. So if I speak in English, I'm caught with the problem. When I speak in Chinese to my Chinese friends, I use different terms and a little bit more precise, not terribly precise, but a little bit more precise than the word Chinese. So it is a difficult one, and yet we cannot run away from it. There is China, and all those people who originally came out of China are, in the eyes of others, Chinese, one way or the other. Whether they like it or not, whether they even look like Chinese anymore, even if you claim any Chinese ancestry, there's only one word for them, Chinese. And so somehow we have to live with it, and I hope we can clarify this now and then better. The other point which I thought was very relevant about Singapore, I totally agree, and this is Singapore's nation building, which your nieces have been subject to, I'm sorry to say. The thing is that and this is a very interesting phenomenon to me, is that all those local-born Straits Chinese, in Penang they call them Straits Chinese, but in Singapore they call them Peranakan or Babas, because they came from Malacca. And they really were Malay-speaking, not unlike Penang. Because in Penang, at least you spoke Chinese, a Chinese dialect. You could keep your one Chinese dialect. But the real Peranakans of Malacca, of various parts of Indonesia, all over Java, Sumatra, Celebes, and so on, didn't speak a word of Chinese at all, not even dialect. They spoke only Malay, or some form of Malay. We call it Bahasa Melayu Tionghoa, the Chinese Malay. And they spoke that as their lingua franca. And what has happened is to see the pressure on them to become Chinese and learn Chinese. You could see that at the end of the 19th century, when people like Lim Boon Keng and all them began to advocate the study of Mandarin. And my mother-in-law, if I may quote a personal story, my mother-in-law went out to Southeast Asia because she was told there were Chinese there who don't know Chinese. Come and do your duty to teach them Chinese. So she was actually employed in a school in Singapore that taught Peranakan, the Babas of Singapore, Mandarin. And they would not learn dialect. It's very interesting, I thought very interesting was that the Peranakan, Lim Boon Keng actually advocated it, that if you're Peranakan and you spoke only Malay at home, don't go and learn any dialect, learn Mandarin. And it is very interesting that Lee Kuan Yew says exactly the same thing, because he's a Peranakan in origin. So what does Lee Kuan Yew say? The first thing he did when he took on this Mandarin campaign was to say, don't use dialect completely. All dialect films, dialect radio, completely switched off. If you want to listen to a Cantonese film, or want to watch a Cantonese film, you switch on to a television Malaysia. Interestingly, you can get it in Malaysia, but not in Singapore. Some excellent films from Taiwan or from Hong Kong using dialect, because there are Taiwan films made in Hokkien and dialect in Cantonese, are not allowed to be shown in Singapore, either in the cinemas or on television. So if you want to do that, you have to buy your own CDs. But that's just an example to show what happened was that when the Peranakans wanted to learn Chinese, no dialect. You must learn the real Chinese, Mandarin, number one. Number two is that when the pressure was so great, almost all the Peranakan gave up their Malay and switched to English. Your nieces preferred to talk English. Absolutely correct. And not only that, I know of hundreds of Peranakan families who left Singapore because their children could not cope with Chinese and didn't want to learn Chinese anymore. And it was genuine. They went to Australia, New Zealand, Canada, United States also, I think, because their children could not cope with this enforced policy of every child must learn their mother tongue in school. And it was, of course, a very unfair thing for the Chinese who come from Peranakan families, from these straight Chinese families, because they never spoke any Chinese dialect at home, whereas all the other Chinese, the far majority of them, spoke some dialect at home. And learning Mandarin or learning Chinese, if you already know a dialect, is much, much easier than learning it as a total foreign language. And so when these children went to school and found themselves with other Chinese children who could speak dialect and switch to Mandarin relatively easily, they were really disadvantaged. To be quite frank, they were totally disadvantaged, and some of them simply could not cope and didn't want to anymore. And their parents, for their children's sake, actually left Singapore. So that is where Singapore was most unsuccessful. They couldn't even keep some of their own local-born Chinese who were part of the loyalists who won. And yet after the victory, they were actually victimized by the policy of the minority having to appease the majority and introduce Chinese as a compulsory subject for anybody of Chinese origin, and in the end driving away or drove away some of the very people who had supported them in the first place. So you can see the paradoxes and conflicts which this word Chinese, Chinese language, Chinese, any kind of Chinese identity creates among those of us who have the fortune of being born Chinese.
On that note, thank you very much, Professor Wang, for a most stimulating as well as provocative talk. We've come to the end of our appointed time, so thank you very much for your attention, and we look forward to carrying on the conversation. Thank you.